not starting it. Whoop. There's some kind of strange snap action on this portal. Guy, I just want... Okay, there we go. So, I know I haven't made a serious video in a while, and I'm just finding that I'm getting to a place with my research where I want to kind of cut to the chase. And I have a couple kind of produced bubble world videos that are still in the oven, but my formal ambitions for them are getting higher, so they take longer to produce. And that's fine, and those videos are probably going to come out at some point. But there's so much about this thing that needs to be documented that I think I need to develop some kind of a practice that is more or less something I can do every day, or at least a couple times a week, that is just going to start kind of laying down the structure of this thing. I'm working on my book again, which is going to be a good place, I think, where a lot of this stuff comes together in a tighter way. So this is going to be a little more scatterbrained, for lack of a better word, because I'm not scripting these out or anything. This is really just more of like picking up a little bit on kind of the diary practice chronologue thing or whatever I was doing, but trying to bring it more into this screencast environment where I can move this around and bring up media and just do all that kind of stuff in real time instead of what I was doing before, which was kind of trying to record myself and then afterwards kind of produce in this flow of imagery that, you end up with pretty cool edits that way, but it's really labor intensive. So anyway, what I really want to talk about is this thing called the Red Twins Constellation. And it's an anomalous set of patterns that myself and actually a number of other people simultaneously have all started to notice in our sort of cinematic media, collective media archive. They seem to point in the direction of some kind of I've just cut to the chase. They seem to point in the direction of some kind of precognitive activity, apparently quite unconscious activity, relating to the destruction of the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. And it's a very fascinating thing to find for a number of reasons. First of all, I have to say that the work is based on on correlative and comparative sorts of methods. So it's not like it's a kind of a smoking gun sort of scenario. It's more like we have a very suggestive set of patterns. And I'm very fond of what Scott Onstadt says about this, which is that, you can be led in the direction of a pattern, and you can be given perhaps a tool set to help you perceive the pattern. But what that pattern means is an infinitely open question in a certain respect. Now, I think that I try to be a realist. I think that not all meanings are equally deep, and in a certain context-dependent sense, not all interpretations are equally correct. I think that there is such a thing as kind of harmony or disharmony in the way that your frame organizes the material underneath it, and you see that with this media analysis stuff pretty quickly. As you swap in different frames or contexts, it's as if the object beneath it is physically morphing in front of you. Of course, what's happening is your perception is changing, and it's revealing different properties or aspects of the thing that were maybe occluded to you in whatever your perspective was before. Now you're trying on kind of a new perspective, maybe just as a kind of a game at first, right? A kind of a toy perspective. And you see, interesting. If I view this film let's say, through the lens of like queer theory. Like, look, the film reads differently. And maybe it reads, it's like, and then you might discover that certain films read more meaningfully underneath that frame than other films, for instance. And so I want to just say at the outset that I don't want to come at you with this thing, overselling it in a certain respect, because fundamentally what it is it's a strange series of patterns that can be perceived in a certain way, and that once you perceive the pattern, it really, really, really looks like, in my opinion, it really looks like a kind of precognitive trace of this historical event. But you may not find it convincing. Or you might find the pattern convincing, but you might completely disagree with my interpretation. You might, at the end of this, if you stick around, say, well, yes, I see that there's a pattern there, and perhaps you'll even agree that it's not purely projective on my part, that there is some objective structure in the artifact. But you may still not think it has anything to do with 9/11 or any of this other business. But really, I think what I want to do with these screencast videos is to just start exploring the constellation. Initially, the point of this video and maybe the next video is going to be a kind of setting up the interpretive system a little bit, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. But after that, I just want to dive into films. And even today, we're going to already start looking at some films, because I think really a lot of the theory and all that sort of stuff, those are just natural things that are going to come up in the conversation as we proceed to take a look at all of the shiny artifacts that await us. So anyway, I want to provide now just a kind of a broad orienting description of my process, I guess. And so to do that, maybe let's go into Photoshop. Don't show this again. Okay. Yeah, let's just get a nice 1000 by 1000 pixels. The first thing I want to do is try to reframe our understanding of what a film is a little bit. Because to me, well, first of all, in fact, let's just say something even more general, which is that things in the world, say a thing like a film, but just objects and phenomena in general, are extraordinarily complex. And they're always more complex than you can explicitly model. So it kind of looks like this. I like to use the Star of David, or esoterically the Seal of Solomon, to represent a transcendentality. The idea behind that structure, by the way, is that you have one triangle representing a positive polarity and one triangle representing the negative pole, and then those get combined together, you see, into this shape. So it represents a union of opposites. And so that's like, I would use that symbol to designate something like reality, which you might now put with an R. And you don't ever get to access this directly, okay? There's an impassable gap around it, like a moat, basically. This is, we might call this something like the moat of transduction or something. Let's put MT for that. And then you have a bunch of sense perception and fundamentally these are sensors that then go into a computational structure, which is like your brain, right? And that's hemispheric, by the way. So you have a left and a right hemisphere that are optimized for slightly different things. And then you have, something. you have some kind of an object perception or an environmental perception. And the idea is that this maps to that in some way. Now, it isn't that. It can't be, because it's precisely a reduced complexity model of that thing. And so, by the way, part of the dialectical idea is that you have frames or paradigms. That's not really where they are. This is sort of an embodied paradigm. Okay, this is the way that your body is and the way your sense perception works, and you don't get to adjust that really, except maybe a little bit with psychedelic drugs. Then you have kind of linguistic frames, and you might have very many linguistic frames, paradigms, language-based models fundamentally. Now, depending on how seriously you take those models, basically, they may actually modify your low-level perception to some degree. So there's a bit of a gradient there. It's not like it's not so hierarchically. Well, it is hierarchically leveled, but there's kind of bleed in between the levels, let's say. And so part of the dialectical idea is that if you can learn to start to perceive your environment through a multiplicity of these frames, instead of just through a single frame, that it's like you're getting, in the aggregate, more and more perspectives, more and more views on this transcendental unity, which is whatever the actual situation is. So if I consider it through this light, I see these parts of it. And if I consider it through this other lens, I see these other parts of it. And gradually, in an asymptotic and circumambulatory fashion, you are triangulating, as it were, certain properties about the real. Or rather, to be completely technically correct about it, you are discovering homomorphisms at some level of analysis, which is a little tricky to figure out at what level of analysis. Which is to say, strictly speaking, you just know that your model maps to the real in some way that takes into account, that tries to be a meta model by taking into account other models, and that has some kind of efficacy. Because then that's the other part of it, right? Is if you're going to assess worldviews, you can't really do that from your philosophical armchair intellectually. Worldviews have to be deployed. And then you live through them, and you see what comes through them, and what they enable, and what they encourage, and what they don't, and so on. You might have a laundry list of kind of evaluative properties there when looking at paradigm. But then you can see the degree to which that paradigm is working according to some standard. Of course, you'd have to define the standard. But let's say the standard is something like health and well-being, right? It could be quite broad. And at the end of your experimental period, you're going to have some kind of metric there to say, well, do I feel healthier? Is my well-being increased? In which ways? Is it purely like a psychological benefit? Sometimes a paradigmatic shift can actually change things in your body, because there are strange placebo effects and loops going on with your nervous system and the deep physical substrate that it's made out of, I think, and it's a question how far that goes. I'm not necessarily making the claim here that some people make, which is that intention could potentially cure even really serious diseases like, say, cancer or something. I don't know that I believe that. Maybe. But I definitely notice that my attitude affects the way I feel physically. So at least at that kind of shallow level, there are interesting loops going on. And it turns out maybe it's actually not so shallow. So I think there's maybe a kind of a middle point there. But so you evaluate it, and then and then what you can say at the end of that is that your paradigm mapped onto the real in a way that was functional, that then enabled these positive results to happen. You still can't really say that it actually resembles the real in any, I want to use the word literal here, that's probably not correct, in any kind of literal way, right? But it's not either like you haven't learned anything about the real. I mean, you have, of course. And also the higher you get with the way you sum those meta models up, right? Kind of, you do get the impression that the realizations become increasingly abstract, but also probably increasingly true, because it's as if you're converging on the fundamental regularities that show up underneath every frame. And that, because they're common to every frame, that means that they represent some persistent quality of the real, probably. So anyway, I could talk about this all day, because this perception stuff is all so fascinating. And it is really, I think, it's at least in part what this whole media analysis trip we're about to take is about in the end. At least part of it is about our relationship to pattern and meaning. And even if the things that I'm going to show you eventually here, you end up thinking are a kind of a mirage or an illusion or a delusion, I think that it's still fascinating to document from the standpoint of because it reveals something about the machine, for lack of a better word. The human psyche is capable of relating to pattern in this way, it turns out. So that's very interesting. I think there may be things to learn there that that myself and nobody else has anticipated. So this is really interesting frontier territory, I would say. Anyway, I'll just keep that minimized in case we want to get back to Photoshop tools. Oh yeah, in fact, that was premature to leave that. Let's make another image here. That doesn't look correct. New. Yeah, why is it always default? Oh, because it's what's in my clipboard or something? I don't know. Anyway, let's get this set up again. So that was... I hope that made basically sense. So now I want to move on to talking about cinema. So I said I wanted to reframe the way we think about cinema, and I want to think about cinema as a kind of box of patterns. Okay, it's not going to be quite big enough. We can always we're in a digital environment. We can always shrink it down later. Okay, so here's our film. The film is the box, and fundamentally, what is this thing? I think today it's perfectly natural to think about it as information. It's a collection of information, and so there's all kinds of there's just all kinds of structure in it. And when you first look at a film, it might kind of look like this, particularly if it's a complicated film. And I don't mean, of course, it's literally going to look like this, but your mental model of it might be very noisy and hard to make sense of. And I think we've all had the experience, of encountering some piece of media and coming away from it feeling like you didn't really fully absorb it. You didn't really understand it. Interestingly, if you watch it again, you might understand more of it, because maybe there's a nuance to it that takes a while for the full weight of the patterns to be felt and for it to kind of grind itself into your perception. So, actually, films are very highly structured. And when you look at a film, there's a big distinction between something called figure and something called ground. It is so hard to do anything with a trackpad, but there we go. I should get a Wacom tablet, but would that be just too pretentious? I don't know. Okay, so this is just something about the way cinema is structured, right? It's the way the cameras work. Cameras are modeled off of our eyes, and cinemas, it's going to be consumed by our visual system, so it's reflective of the structure of our visual system. So this is actually something about human perception. Human perception has a figure and ground relationship always. What that means is that you have a focal point of attention, and what you're paying attention to is the figure. It's what you're concerned with. And everything that you're not seeing, that's the ground. That's what surrounds the point of attention. And, of course, your point of attention is flexible. You can shift it to different spots. And so it's possible for things that at one point in time are in the ground to become the figure, and vice versa. You're constantly performing these inversions as you move your attention through your environment. And so, in cinema, we have things in the foreground. That would be, for instance, right now, my face. My face is figure. And it's very natural for you to pay attention to what's in the figure because it's the focus of the camera and it's the focus of your attention, and to ignore what's going on in the background. Because what's going on back here? Well, there's like a wall here and some shadows and it's kind of a nice white beige color or whatever. But it's we make an assumption that there's not important information there. And maybe that's right or maybe that's wrong. But that's kind of the point of it, is that the ground is the stuff that, at least for the time being, you've kind of bracketed as irrelevant. Okay, I think we all get that. And so, in the physical structure of cinema, there's this reflection of a psychological structure. And I want to push that metaphor a little harder and say that, in fact, again, this is one frame on cinema. There are many ways to relate to cinema. Cinema is a transcendental complexity. You don't know what's in it yet. So you have to be a little bit humble before it and not say cinema is this, cinema is that. So one way to view cinema, but I feel a way that reveals very deep structure about cinema, is to view it as a kind of record or deposit of psychical activity, right? Psyche's made these things, films. And so there's a distributed quality to it as well. Sometimes it's more like from one person's dome right out into the celluloid. Kubrick maybe is sort of that way, although those were still very huge productions with a lot of people involved. He was very tyrannical, actually, about the placement of all the detail in his film. My jargon word for ground, by the way, is the microsymbolic plane. That's what I refer to it as in the context of triplanar analysis, which is about interpreting symbolic fields in cinema. And so I would say about Kubrick that Kubrick is one of the great first and already great masters of conscious, deliberate manipulation of the microsymbolic plane. That just means that Kubrick's there in the background arranging every can on the shelf, right? But so anyway, this is, if you think about film as something that's a kind of a record of psychological events, suddenly it becomes perhaps possible to recover psychological dynamics by looking at the films. And so that would be like a basic psychoanalysis, basically. And in a sense, you're kind of psychoanalyzing maybe the director or the screenwriter, something like that, if you're going to personalize it like that. And this makes, I think, a good deal of sense. It's not so far-fetched to think that you could learn things about someone's subjectivity and about their psychology by looking at the art they make, because things come out in art, and a lot of things come out that are perhaps unconscious. And so actually part of what I want to argue here is that the ground in cinema is correlated with the unconscious. It's what we're not paying attention to when we watch it, but we're absorbing things in the ground unconsciously. And certain filmmakers, actually I think most filmmakers, know that happens, and so very often you do see things deliberately placed in the ground. And we're going to look at an example of that in just a second. But I want to set up this whole kind of this basic little model first, so it's clear what we're doing when we jump into the media analysis. The correct way to think about this really is that when we look at cinema, sort of as naively as possible, and say, okay, here's this big box of patterns. One of the first things you notice is that there seem to be two classes of pattern in it, right? One of those is the figure, and one of them is the ground. So this is not a result of thinking about a psychological theory and then imposing it onto the structure. This is really a property of cinema. It's just the case. Every frame you look at has action happening in the figure, and then there's a background behind it. So that's just that's an emergent property of what film is. Now, I've already kind of given away a big piece of the idea here, which is that there may be information in the ground. So we should look in the ground. We should look at the ground and see, we should gaze into the microsymbolic plane and see if there's any kind of structure there. Now there's a problem, which is that the ground tends to be quite noisy. There's all kinds of things in the background of a shot. You don't know what's relevant and what isn't. So that means that it's possible, by the way, to project a lot of things into that noise. And incidentally, I think we probably do have to talk about projection now just a little bit, but this is a good opportunity to plug my Instagram account. I do these Photoshop layer things these images are like very deeply stacked in terms of, an image like this one might have over 50, probably less than 100 layers in that in the end. It doesn't necessarily look like that in the end, but but that's the process. It's kind of this thing emerging out of these layers as you stack them. And so this is kind of a Cyclops thing. And so Cyclops has been on my mind, evidently. And this morning in the shower, I was looking at the patterns in the stonework in the shower, and it just suddenly kind of clicked in front of me. There's a Cyclops there. Now, every day I get in that shower and I see different things in those patterns, and it's a reflection actually of what's on my mind. Cyclops is on my mind. I saw the Cyclops in the structure. It's like looking at clouds. My friend Alan Waller has an amazing channel which you should check out, where he's doing, I think, really some pretty groundbreaking thinking about time and synchronicity. But he talks about projection and excellently and in some depth. And I'm going to just kind of paraphrase some of his thoughts here. But it's like, if he uses the example of like if you're hungry and you're looking at the clouds, you might start to see food in the clouds. And so there's this notion that we have in our culture that if something is a projection, you ought to just throw it out and not pay any attention to it, is a very, very strange, to my mind, just an extraordinarily odd response to the discovery that something like projection exists. Because I see it more as a channel of communication, right? There's potential information there. It's a solipsistic kind of information. It's information about yourself. But once you understand that you might know things unconsciously, that you don't know consciously, projection then becomes like a window into your unconscious. And it's possible then to surface unconscious material through the projective surface, through the projective scrim or screen or medium or whatever it is. And if that's seeing shapes in the clouds, maybe you didn't know you were hungry. That's actually, it probably sounds sort of silly, it's a problem I have. Like, I don't eat. I forget to eat. I get absorbed in thinking. I get absorbed in working. And so if suddenly in my sort of projective fantasy field, like a lot of food starts showing up, and I can notice that, well, that was a way for some lower level systems concerned with things like, surviving, it was a way for them to notify me of it. And I think this can go even much deeper, particularly when you start getting into self-improvement and sort of deeper psychological work. It's like, it's a way of recovering all kinds of repressed traumas, and you can really go very deep with the process. But so, anyway, my point is that even if what you encounter in the microsymbolic plane is, in a sense, purely projective, and even if it's purely projective in a very personal, subjective, let's say, way, it could still be a useful structure to perceive and to recover. And so it could be that that's all I'm doing here, that this whole thing is one giant unconscious projection of something. And I've tried to give that some thought. Okay, what would that be if it was just purely personal? But I don't think that it is. I think that cinema, like any cultural artifact, it's partly about the artist's subjectivity, and it's partly about the perceiver's subjectivity. But I think that there's also deeper psychological currents that can be recorded in an artifact like a film. And that becomes very obvious when you look at, when you do, for instance, political reads of older films. because now you can see what the context is, and it's like, oh, now I understand. Indiana Jones isn't just a fantasy; it's also a weird collection of ideas about American identity and American imperialism, actually, and sort of the shadow of American identity haunts those films. And I think that's objective structure. I think that's unconscious on the part of the filmmakers, probably. Maybe not totally. I mean, Steven Spielberg is a very smart guy. Some of this stuff is probably deliberate, but some of it's just there in a way by osmosis. It's like the historical and the cultural conditions leave an impression, or like they leave an imprint in the artifact. And I think you can recover that often by looking at the ground. I also think that you can recover even deeper currents in the ground that reach the level of the collective unconscious. Let's say I should probably get out of the way here that I basically am operating in a Jungian framework about a lot of this. Okay, don't be so quick to throw out projection. You don't know what information might be there. It's very, very bad to toss out, to just throw away information that you haven't even sat with. I mean, one has to do that to some degree because there's just an overload of information coming in. But it's very tragic with something like a film that's so delicately composed that people don't even, it's like, come on, let's swim to a slightly depthier place and look at what's going on. So okay, let's look at the ground. But also let's consider the ground in relation to the figure still. Maybe. It depends. But the point is that there's also things, there's things happening in the figure. And it's less noisy, right? But what happens if sometimes you start to find like strange points of correspondence between some of these details in the ground and some of these larger things happening in the figure? So that's something that the sort of godfather of deep learning neural networks, Geoffrey Hinton, would describe as a high-dimensional coincidence.
Now, the point about high-dimensional coincidences is they don't happen by chance. Even if I have a six-dimensional thing, and I have two six-dimensional things that agree on every dimension to within 10% relative to the normal variation, then there's a chance of 1 in a million of that. So if you see a few things that agree sharply, it's not this coincidence can't just be a coincidence, if you see what I mean. There's something really must have caused it. A model of this is if you think about filtering intelligence information, if you see all sorts of conversations that say New York or say September, that doesn't mean much. But if you see a whole bunch of conversations, maybe just 4 of them, that say New York, September the 11th, and you see 4 of those, you should get extremely suspicious, because now it's a high-dimensional coincidence. And even if there's lots of other things that say Chicago and blah, 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 the fact that it's high-dimensional is a coincidence should make you think there's something real going on. Okay.
So when you see things like that starting to happen in a film, you can pretty much take it seriously, I think, as some kind of structure. Again, what it means, the hermeneutic aspect of that, how we interpret it, it's a different sort of question. But just the existence of the pattern, you can determine that to a large extent in a way that's agnostic to the content in a certain sense, right? It's about the actual structure and the dynamics of the pattern itself. And patterns that manifest across multiple levels of organization simultaneously in a way that's temporally proximate, let's say. So, let's say all together in a single frame of the film, for instance, or some short duration. Things like that are high-dimensional and very unlikely to occur at chance. Then there's something else that's kind of like above. That's really ugly, but I'll just put it up here and kind of put rays shooting out like that so you can see the sense in which it stands kind of above the other two. And this is what I was saying before. This is kind of the zone of paradigms, linguistic models, frames, context. And there's tons of contexts here. Okay, it gets all fractal out here because contexts are embedded in contexts and so on. And this is what we were talking about before, basically. The film is a transcendental complexity, okay? So the whole thing is a big unity that then you're going to try to perceive patterns in, and pretty much no matter what frame you're looking at the artifact through, it's going to have this figure ground structure underneath it. So that's like a figure and ground are meta categorical things that persist through these frame swaps. But so like one of those frames would be just, for instance, all of our cultural understanding of what a film is. We have an expectation that it's going to have a story. We know a lot of things unconsciously about the language of cinema and how to interpret it, and that's all baked into our, what I sometimes call our standard frame. And then there are other things, and there are culturally specific things, say like nationally specific things, so that a film might be very comprehensible in the Japanese standard frame, but when you frame transition into the American standard frame, the film doesn't quite make as much sense anymore, or there are strange contrary or like ancillary meanings or something that start getting pushed to the fore. So that's all things that happen up there with this top level of frame. Sometimes when I'm feeling annoying, I call this the firmament. In my technical jargon, it's the macro symbolic plane. So you have micro symbolic plane, micro symbolic, that's miss. That's the ground, and then the figure is the meso-symbolic plane. It's MES. And then up here we have finally the macro-symbolic plane, or mass. So mass, mess, miss. The macro-symbolic plane, you'll notice, is something invisible and abstract. It doesn't map so well onto, in a sense, physical structure in the film, the way that figure and ground do. This is something that's, and because of that, it's modifiable. And so that's how you can do the frame swaps. You can say, well, I'm going to interpret the film under this arbitrary framework, and see what happens. And what you'll see is all kinds of interesting games can be played that way. You can interpret films, interpret anything, inside of very many interesting frames, and they all reveal interesting things. But again, there is this broad notion of kind of... it's very annoying to have to specify this every time. I should look into, modifying a preference somewhere. See if I can get that to not happen in the future. But look, it's just something like something like this. Okay, if I apply a frame up at the macro symbolic level, here's my frame, and remember this is a picture of something underneath it that forever eludes my direct grasp or perception. Okay, and I put it through, and something like this comes out, and then up here there's, something that looks somewhat meaningful. Well, that's interesting. I would have a lot of questions about that. What is that, and why is that showing up in that frame? And there may be some tools we could use to think about that. But basically, this is high dissonance. And it may be that you're working with an artifact where almost every frame you apply to it has a lot of dissonance. Sometimes people deliberately make art that way, because it's supposed to be kind of a weird magic mirror just reflecting your own interior states. And a trade-off of that is that it feels a little noisy. But then you might have a situation where you apply a frame, say a very different sort of frame, maybe a whole different category of frame, at say a different sort of level of macro-symbolic nesting than whatever you were working with over here. And under this one, something like this shows up. Well, you'd feel like you found a certain hermeneutic key, wouldn't you? Purely on the basis of the fact that here we have something very harmonic, and here we have something very dissonant. And so I think that there's something about harmony of pattern as modified by macro-symbolic frames that we ought to take into consideration when thinking about interpreting transcendental complexities. So, anyway, back to this completely... I'm so sorry about these, what is it, Doc Brown, please excuse the crudity of my models kind of thing. But hopefully you get the idea. So, okay, so then part of my claim is that if you apply a kind of Jungian psychological frame to certain artifacts, certain films, you get something that looks like this. Okay? You get it's a remarkably harmonic frame. Things align and fall together underneath it. And it makes sense because Jung's theories were developed in connection with mythology and literature in a certain way, but certainly with the realm of human fantasy, which films are also reflective of. But then in addition to just finding a lot of psychological insight, you also start to find these strange contents. There are these weird little pockets, and they look like precognitive contents. Now that's also very interesting because the whole Jungian system is built from the ground up to accommodate things like precognition, and in fact was developed in response to Jung's own precognitive experiences. And I haven't had the chance, to make all these nice fancy videos I wanted to make to explain a little bit more about where I'm coming from with all this stuff, but I also count myself amongst experiencers of precognitive phenomena. So that may be coloring my interpretation of this stuff, of course. It's part of the reason of making these videos is to, offload some of these ideas to the network a little bit, and then you guys can tell me if you're following and if you think this stuff makes sense, or if there are, which I'm sure there are, massive problems. But in any case, this is a good high-level view of what I'm talking about when I talk about triplanar analysis. Right? Here's the three planes: macrosymbolic, mesosymbolic, microsymbolic. Now, the last piece of this is that I don't have quite the language for this yet, but I have a notion that there's a macrosymbolic frame that can be universally agreed upon, and that's significant. That ought to be taken into account. And I basically think about that as mapping onto sort of like the back of the DVD description. If that's even a metaphor that makes sense to anybody still. But the idea being, or let's just say the Wikipedia synopsis, it's like the plot synopsis. That's a basic orienting frame. So like nobody could really disagree with the statement that, say, Back to the Future is a film about time travel. It's just very obvious. Obviously it's a film about time travel. You have to be careful because you can't make that reductive. Back to the Future is a film about many things, but an overarching organizing theme in the film is quite obviously time travel. And there are some other themes we could say are overarching themes about it. But the interesting thing is, well, how do you know that? Well, you might know that because someone told you, but really the way that you know it is by looking at here, let's just get the window again. I can type in 1000 by 1000 pixels for the 1000th fucking time. Swap that, don't forget to turn that. See, now it's starting to become a little more automatic. It's getting quicker every time I do it. Getting that autonomic assist going on. What was I in the middle of saying? My hand already knows, but my brain doesn't know where we're going yet, right? So we're looking at the structure, and we see that there's patterns that are happening, say, between figure and ground. Shit, what was I saying with this? Oh, right, kind of this notion of the consensus frame. Maybe that's the way to put it. Consensus frame happens because as you're watching these patterns move through time in the film, you start perceiving regularities. And one regularity is that time travel, either explicitly in the dialogue, or in the action, or in the imagery, is happening again and again and again. It's like pictures of clocks, it's like dialogue about the future, and then it becomes explicitly about there's a time travel narrative, and then we're traveling through time, and we have time traveling technology, and we have conversations about the nature of time. So it's about the repetition of it. It's that it appears again, repetition and centrality. Because it's not just that it repeats a lot, it's also that the theme of time seems to relate to other structures in the film in a kind of a network structure. So there are other themes, but those themes all seem like they're, in a sense, derivative of, or at any rate, kind of point back to the central theme of time. So I call that centrality. Repetition and centrality both give weight to the pattern, but they're two different metrics, and you can have one without the other, potentially. But very often you see them both together. And certainly in something like Back to the Future, the idea of time and time travel is both highly central and highly repetitive. And then there are probably many things like that. We could also say that, Back to the Future is a love story to a certain extent, and there are deeper things we could say about it as well. The deeper you get, the farther away from consensus frame you probably get, because consensus frame tends to be relatively shallow. It's precisely about the patterns that are the most shallow, that are right there at the surface and very easy to perceive. So that makes up something that in the triplanar context I sometimes just informally refer to as the macro symbolic plane. Even though technically the macro symbolic plane is it's actually an infinity of potential frames and a whole bunch of kind of nested, inherited frames, let's say. But very often I use it just to refer to this notion of the consensus frame. So the consensus frame then becomes a kind of master organizing pattern that you can then reference against structures in both the figure and the ground. And so if you find a pattern that is high dimensional and highly temporally proximate, that is manifesting across all three levels of analysis there. So there are things in the ground that conform to the pattern, there are things in the figure that conform to the pattern, and then there are things in the consensus frame that also conform to the pattern. That's a very high dimension, that becomes extraordinarily high, almost like meta-dimensional then. Well, then the next step there would be to take that whole thing and then you might start to notice that you're finding very similar or perhaps even identical structures appearing in multiple artifacts. And now you're tracking that, let's say, a high-dimensional meta-coincidence across multiple films. And that's then what I refer to as a constellation. So I'm going to make the argument that this red twins phenomenon I'm talking about is of this caliber. It's something that shows up in a number of films. And the important thing about it is that it's not like a single point, of course. It's a vector, actually. It's this dense stack of a whole sort of connective structure that it pulls with it. So, okay, that was my super throw a bunch of crazy stuff crash course at you about this different way of thinking about film. I imagine some of that's not clear, that the stuff that dips into the Jungian theory a little bit more. But, okay, that's the first hour here. I'm going to take a short break to, drink some water, maybe get a snack, and then we'll jump into looking at our first piece of media. Thanks for sticking around. Goggles on, ready to do some media analysis. First, I wanted to say just one last thing about this whole business over here. Actually, I'm going to step back. Something I didn't say here that I want to make sure is clear is that, obviously, one way that you might get this result is if you have a frame that is like this, right? These lines are to designate that it's opaque there. So this is a frame that's a kind of a filter that only lets through things in the shape of a cross and blocks out everything else. So obviously if that's your frame, you're going to see that thing everywhere. Of course, I'm going to be arguing that the frames we're applying with this triplanar method are not like this, and that they're not just imposing their own structure into the thing. Of course, it'll be up to you to decide if you think you agree with me about that. But all of that's just going to come out of the media analysis, really. So, Captain America, Civil War. This is going to be my first sort of intro into this. This is a film that came out in 2016. And is this cool or is this stupid? I think it's kind of cool because you can see the reflection of the screen in there, which I think is fun. On the other hand, you can't see my eyes, so it actually makes it less expressive. Maybe I should just cool it with the weird sunglasses, huh? But, so this is a huge superhero movie that does not announce itself as having anything to do with American politics, except in its title, perhaps. And it certainly doesn't announce itself as having anything to do with September 11th. But this is obviously a film about September 11th, right? And that's not controversial. Basically, pretty hard to disagree with that. And if you go online and type in Captain America 9/11, you'll find a lot of, I think, pretty good think pieces discussing the ways in which this film speaks to 9/11 and the post 9/11 American experience. And this is actually an instance of a film that was based on a graphic, pretty strongly based on a particular graphic novel, as opposed to being kind of a newly imagined entry in a fictional universe. This is really quite directly adapted from the comic book, which came out in 2006. It's called Civil War, right? And this is, again, I bet if we search for freedom versus security, the basic human dilemma from 9/11 to Marvel's Civil War, right? So, so the graphic novel already is already a piece about 9/11, and the film preserves this. And everybody understands that the film preserves that on the basis of on the basis of the traditional thing, which is macro symbolic structure inferred from the figure, basically. If you pay attention to the narrative structure and what's happening in the figure, so the main plot or the events in the movie, and a lot of the dialogue, it's clear that that it's just kind of one slight contextual reconfig away from being about 9/11, right? So as you watch the movie and as you watch the figure has persistent patterns in it that send you the message, this is a film about 9/11. But there are also ways in which this film very subtly signals that it's about 9/11, and it does that in the ground and in the subtext. And I think this is a really good place to start because it should be really non-controversial. This movie came out in 2016. There's large consensus that the film is about 9/11. So I'm just going to point you in the direction of some nice subliminal touches in this film that that signal 9/11 in a way that's a little bit below your threshold and is very tightly related to what's happening in the ground. I'm just going to start it here. I want to make my volumes not too high. So we open on a kind of a wintry wasteland. And then immediately we have this number 1991 juxtaposed on top of it. Now you might say, well, it's just a date, but this is a piece of fiction, so nothing's arbitrary. Well, some things may be kind of chancy or arbitrary, but something like a date is, there's maybe potential information there. It's just part of the way that we relate to trauma, is certain things become symbols or emblematic and then become like light triggerers of that trauma. And if 9/11 is a kind of national trauma, or maybe even a global trauma, 1991, it's not 9/11, but it's visually close enough to that number that I think it can serve as a slight subliminal trigger. But it's also very interesting because 1991 is the year that the Soviet Union splintered. And so it's generally thought as marking the end of the Cold War. Now, this is a film in which there's a kind of a Russian bogeyman as the part of the antagonist network in the film, and so it certainly is in reference to the fall of the Soviet Union, but it's also about the beginning of American involvement deeper involvement in the Middle East, which happens with the first Iraq War, the Gulf War, I guess I should say, also in 1991, which is also an interesting relationship there because it's like America emerges from the Cold War as the dominant superpower and is really unchallenged now. American hegemony is firmly established after 1991, and the very first thing we do is get involved in some kind of conflict in the Middle East. And then that involvement just continues straight through into the current, what I would describe as these wars of empire that we're now fighting. It's not all they are, of course. Again, I don't ever mean to be reductive, but also sometimes we just have to use shorthand, and this isn't a political video. Or rather, I'm choosing not to emphasize the political dimension of this video. I want to also point out that these associations with this number, whoops, too many nines there. Instinctually went for the triple rep digit there. Right, if you look up 1991, you see here the year usually considered the final year of the Cold War. And then we have a mention of the Gulf War, mark the beginning of a since-constant American military presence in the Middle East. So this is all right there at the very beginning of the big consensus Wikipedia thing, right? And Wikipedia is not so great always for pure facts, but it's always I find it's a pretty good reflection of, like, popular consensus about stuff. So these are very common associations with this number. But see, then it starts to make the Soviet Union thing seem like it's more about the transition of world power. So right here in this very first frame, we have 9/11, a transition of power in the world historical stage, America's involvement in the Middle East and relationship to Russia, interestingly. And this is before the whole Russian hacking story. It's like right before that dropped, actually. So this film is a little prescient in that way. But all of that's stacked up here right in the first frame. Also, we could go even deeper with our analysis of this number and observe that it's made out of ones and nines, which are fundamentally columns and spirals. Spirals are symbols that are very often associated with the goddess and with the womb, in fact, and with birth. Portals also generally associated with spiral. And the pillar is a phallus. So we have here two very archetypal images, pictographically kind of overlaid there in that number, spirals and columns, that also happen to be sequenced palindromically. So the whole thing is mirror form. And I have an idea that mirror form symbols like this, whether they're numbers or letters or any kind of shape, are natural symbols of duality, but particularly of the relationship of the conscious mind to the unconscious mind. It seems that the unconscious's way of representing this is often with mirrors, or with reflective ponds, or things of that sort. That's the archetypal structure there, at least in the Jungian view. And I think all of that is captured in that number. So, by the way, I tend to err on the side of including things, because I don't know what might be useful yet. And if that means we get some false positives, like maybe not all of that's intentional, right? Probably not all of that's intentional. But I would say for sure the reference to the Gulf War, and the proximity of it to the numbers 9/11, I think those are probably deliberate. And I think that the other stuff, even though it's not deliberate, that's the whole thing about this archetypal substrate. It's the stuff that just kind of happens whether you intend it or not. But, okay. Then we get a bunch of exposition, which isn't so important for this video. So I'm so sorry, but I'm gonna skip over some of this. Now we're in a scene with our heroes in the present day. Okay, we're not in the United States, but we're in some apparently quasi-westernized country, right? She's drinking tea, so we're on the outer reaches of empire, let's say. And what are they doing? Well, they're sitting around looking a little, a little paranoid. They're looking at details, actually. They're inferring things based on environmental cues. Terrorists, weapons. So all of this is situating us in a post-9/11 world. Private security.
You guys know I can move things with my mind, right? Looking over your shoulder needs
needs to become second nature.
Anybody ever tell you you're a little paranoid?
Paranoid. So we're living in the post-9/11 world here, and we're going to get some more strange protrusions of world historical elements into our fantasy here in a second. We're going to see basically a drone weapon deployed here, which is, I think that the drone phenomena is deep in the unconscious of the country right now. It's something we don't really want to look directly at so much. because a drone to us is something we play around with in our backyard, but it's also this massive, this horrifying techno weapon, you know. Okay, looking into, you know, this we're sort of coding surveillance state things here, and it's all sorts of interesting things one could say about this scene. But the point is that now we're going to get this action sequence that takes place here at the Institute of Infectious Diseases. Okay, we're going to get a vehicular collision. Now, I would argue that already, in a movie in 2018 still, I'm going to actually pause this for a second. Already, this is stuff that you could argue is subliminal 9/11 imagery, in the sense that, for instance, Godzilla is about the atomic bomb. You know, there's a whole era of Japanese monster films that are all about Hiroshima. They can't be it can't be approached yet explicitly, so it's transfigured mythopoeically. But that's what those films are really about. You have to be a little you have to be very shallowly relating to the artifact to miss that aspect of it. It's like such an obvious correlation to make between what was happening in history and what was happening in those films. And so I would argue that this kind of thing is the same sort of thing. Any American movie that shows vehicles crashing into buildings with explosions, that's orbiting around this nexus of trauma in the national psychology. But it's going to get much more explicit here. Also, note the if I zoom, is that going to work on the screencast? I wonder. Let's hope that it does. So you can see here this beam sort of structure is very similar to the architecture of the World Trade Center. Let's see if I can find. Not that this is so, you know, so unique in the world or whatever, but and also this is. That's not the Twin Towers. Here we go. Right. But this was, I think, a fairly iconic aspect of that building, and it's echoed here in the imagery, right? So okay, continuing. Okay, so here, you know, this to me is just very, very evocative of the whole World Trade Center installation and the smoke passing through the columns in that way. So far we're just in the realm of fairly light, imagistic reference, something like that. It's actually pretty subtle so far, I would say. This is an interesting frame because we have kind of two rectangular structures, little cubes in the middle, and then a big spiral disc. This is again like a spiral and two columns seen from on top. There's a little bit of a subliminal sort of 9/11 structure there. Admittedly, something like that is a very, very faint thing, and on its own doesn't count for very much. Hard to pick that apart from chance or noise, but I just like to note these things because it's a perceivable structure there. All right, so here we go. This imagery of Captain America being blown out of the window and impacting the pavement, you know, that's all starts to be evocative now of like the jumpers, which is the most horrific and probably most repressed part of the 9/11 narrative, I think, in my view anyway.
Take this to the airstrip. We're not going to outrun him. Lose the truck.
Okay, and then we have here, now this guy is going to end up being a suicide bomber. So now we have a theme of, well, not a theme precisely yet, but a suicide bombing is introduced into the thematic network here. Now this part I think is sort of interesting. He blows himself up, but our psychokinetic character uses her ability to constrain the explosion in this little force field. See, and then she maneuvers it into the air and maneuvers it over the building, over the tower. So it's literally as if the tower is kind of magnetically attracting this explosion in the symbolic field here. The explosion and the tower want to go together, and here we're going to see them go together. Up it goes, and then it crashes right into the building, and now we see them all looking at it, so we're setting up that we're about to see a really shocking image, a really powerful image, and then what we get is something that is, I would say, a very obvious now recreation of 9/11 imagery. This is moved from being kind of subtle imagistic correspondence into now this is quite clearly this is deliberate. You can't put an image like this in a film post 9/11 and not be referencing 9/11. Just even kind of the angle and the colors in it and the whole, it looks so much like the media images that we all know so well. So okay.
Sam, we need fire and rescue on the south side of the building. You gotta get up there.
Right, and now we now come out of that very strong piece of visual reference. We get this piano song. Try to remember the kind of September. So now suddenly we have this month, September, dropped in there right after we see that image. So, you might notice that or you might not. In a way, I think the filmmakers are maybe counting on the fact that you don't precisely notice it explicitly. But if you pay attention to these subtle details, you'll see that, that's funny. There's another aspect that seems to correspond. Let's actually get up the song, Harry Belafonte, yeah. Deep in December, it's nice to remember the fire of September that made you mellow. Deep in December, our hearts should remember and follow, right? So, deep in December, in the winter, we already saw the winter. The winter opened the film in the first frame with the big 1991. Now this song that's playing references the winter and urges us to remember. Remember September and the fire of September. So September and fire are connected here, and we just had this image of the fire blowing up the tower, an obvious reference to 9/11. And so it's about remembering this trauma of the fire in September. And we're just getting that through this little piece of subtext. But this is actually a pretty good example of something, which is that the micro-symbolic plane is very closely related to the idea of ground, but it's not exactly ground. Because where is this song? Is that in figure? Is that in ground? It's kind of almost in figure. So far it's the focus of the scene. We're looking at her singing it, and it's explicit dialogue. But then the part of it that we've marked as meaningful is this reference to a month, which is subtextual. So fundamentally what we're talking about is something like subtextual detail, which often shows up in the ground, but can also show up in other ways. All of those ways are contained in this notion of the microsymbolic plane. Also in this frame, we have a burning candle. Now if you look at 9/11 artwork, not all of it of course, but a fair amount of it, I would say, involves two things. One is that it often involves candles, right? Here we go. It'll just take a second to open some of these. I mean, just take your pick, really. There's a lot of different ones here. So this is pretty good because this is just sort of how people were symbolically representing the event in its immediate aftermath. And you can see that a lot of these have this theme actually of double candles. It's a very natural sort of symbolic correspondence between the two towers burning and two burning candles. Candles, of course, also being things that you use to mark vigils and to mark, to honor the dead, fundamentally, right? So you see a lot of this sort of stuff. Here's again, 2 candles, 2 red roses. Here we don't have candles, but we have the towers represented theriomorphically as a pair of wolves. So, 2 wolves inside of a crystal ball, thus denoting something about fate. Now, maybe this was the image before 9/11 happened and they just put the badge there, But even if so, it's not an inappropriate image, so that works. Got Steven Tyler's. But again, an angel and a candle. Again, 2 candles, a single torch, 2 American flags. A whole bunch of candles in front of a symbol of the self, in fact, a mandala structure here in the stained glass work. Now, of course, I picked these images because they had candles in them. You can see there are a variety of images here. But the point is just that it's a very natural symbol of 9/11 is the burning candle, and especially 2 burning candles. But even a single burning candle, here with the mention of September, lyrics about remembering the fire of September. We have the burning candle right after we saw the burning tower, right? This is a young Tony Stark back here, Iron Man.
Who's the homeless person on the couch?
Notice that he is in a red hat, and that he's very close in the frame to that burning candle. So a person in a red hat, or with red hair, maybe, is also a symbol of the tower, the burning tower. And that comes up in the first, and so far really the only major, I would say, significant piece of art made about 9/11. So this is called The Cycle of Terror and Tragedy, September 11th, 2001. It's by Graydon Parrish, who's this really sophisticated oil painter. And you can see that he's chosen to represent the tower as a pair of twins, male twins in this case, with red bandanas. Here's the plane. Here we have 3 women, one of whom is holding a candle. So the association to the candle is intact here as well. And this is a subtler sort of maneuver, and who knows if it was deliberate or not. But the 3 women could be considered to relate to the triple goddess, and to Hecate in particular, who's a triple-headed, torch-bearing goddess. Here she is with her twin black dogs, her twin flames, and her relationship to the moon, because she's a kind of a lunar goddess in a certain way. And so Hecate is present here archetypally, or at least perhaps Persephone, or something in that zone of correspondence anyway. So that imagery here, which is this attempt to think through 9/11 in symbolic terms in art, seems like it's being utilized here as well, right? We have the man in the red cap, and we have the burning candle, we have the song about September.
This is why I love coming over at Christmas, right before you leave town.
Be nice, dear. He's been studying
Really, which broad? What's her name?
Oh, and I should say the last kind of thing about this Hecate thing is that it's not so far away then from the Statue of Liberty, which is another torch-bearing goddess. So in the parish piece, it's almost like it's also the Statue of Liberty there. So you kind of have a complete Manhattan skyline. That's an interesting little series of relations that we'll see a lot of as we step through this stuff.
Candace, do me a favor.
So there's this whole thing about Tony's relationship with his dad here, and we could psychoanalyze that. Although very quickly we're going to figure out that there's a much bigger
You might have
context
to
here.
make a quick stop at the Pentagon, right?
We mentioned the Pentagon. That was another
You know, they say
target
sarcasm is a
on
metric
9/11.
for potential. If that's true, you'll be a great man someday. I'll get the bags.
He does miss you when you're not here.
So if you're a close watcher of media, you may be freaking out already at this weird CGI Robert Downey Jr. But the film does something interesting here.
Frankly,
Because they've de-aged him here.
You're going to miss us.
And you know it looks uncanny because the tech just isn't that good yet still.
You know what's about
But the film actually is going to acknowledge that. There's an interesting like little, I don't know what you call it, diegetic nod or something.
I love you, Dan. And I know you did the best you could.
I love you, Dad, and I know you did the best you could. But then we're going to see that, in fact, this whole thing, because what's happening in the ground, adult Tony, present-day Tony, is back there. And we're going to shift, our focus is now going to shift from the youthful
That's how I
Tony
wish it happened.
to the adult Tony.
Binarily augmented retroframing.
Binarily augmented retroframing. I wish it happened this way. So we're looking at a historical event, but our subjectivity is rolled up in how we perceive it.
Or BARF. God, I gotta work on that acronym. An extremely costly method
Pretty good job,
of
yeah.
hijacking the hippocampus
Hijacking hippocampus
to clear,
to clear traumatic memories.
traumatic
Also, though, this is weird because it's almost as if the film is describing itself, potentially. Right? The film is an extraordinarily expensive means of hijacking the hippocampus to clear traumatic memories. And that's what this film is, in a sense, going to do, or aspire to do, is it's going to show you, it's going to be a film about 9/11, which is the traumatic memory, without directly doing that. So it's going to hijack you, and it's going to clear a trauma, it's going to help you process a trauma, but in a way that's very sophisticated, that's a little subliminal, and is working unconsciously at least as much as it's working consciously. So it's almost as if the film here is giving you a hermeneutic clue as to how to interpret it. And you might say that's an interesting sort of category, right? That's an interesting thing to encounter in a film. It's there are certain films that do seem to do this. They hide important context in the subtext. So in reading the subtext, you might learn things that provide useful orienting frames for understanding the film as a whole. Kubrick does this all the time, right? To understand The Shining, you have to look into the ground. You have to perceive all the little patterns that reveal out it's not just about a family and a guy going crazy. It's also about genocide, and it's about American, the horror of American history, right? And to understand those, and world history to some degree, and understand those things, you have to correlate the figure in the ground, right? So anyway,
memories.
it's going to try to blow out the
It
candle.
doesn't change the fact that
Now we
they
see
never
it's
made
all
it to the airport.
digital simulation.
For all the
Airport,
things I did to avoid processing my grief.
airport, processing grief. We're all still in 9/11
Plus
proximate language here.
611 million.
And then we have this, plus 611 million for my little therapeutic experiment. So this now, to me, is like very on the nose. 611 is very close visually to 9/11. And, I mean, come on. Obviously, that's a deliberate reference to 9/11, particularly taken in context of all these things we've seen so far. Also, it's just a strange number. 611? When you're just making up a number, you don't tend to, why not just say 100 million? or 500 611. It's like so specific. Well, obviously there's a reason it's so specific. It's part of the subliminal structure here that's telling you the film is about 9/11.
$8 for my little therapeutic experiment.
And now we see that he's on a stage.
No one in their right mind would have ever funded it. Help me out. What's the MIT
And it's a
statement?
little dark, but they're going to become illuminated here.
Generate.
We do have two rectangular, sort of tower-like pillars here with red stripes. So this is continuing to, again, micro-symbolically, in terms of just this detail in the ground, to subliminally signal in the direction of 9/11.
Disseminate and preserve knowledge. And work with others to bring it to bear on the world's great challenges.
Okay, I
Well,
think that's
You are the others.
probably as deep as I want to go into Captain America for now. It's a fascinating film, and one could do a very in-depth analysis of this film. But I just wanted to use it as a way to sort of introduce the practice a little bit. In this case, I think that these things we found in the ground are entirely deliberate. It's all just so perfectly organized there. And again, it's not controversial that the film is about 9/11, so it's not a... What's surprising is that there's this level of care in a massive blockbuster production like this. These are things I associate with weird art house directors and serious more serious films. But these are serious films, of course. I think that these comic book movies are very, very deep attempts to work through some very, very serious things. Maybe it's time to open Photoshop again. Because don't do that, stupid computer. Now it's 313. That's a see, I refer to this as a numeroglyph. It's this whole class of number that's I think proximate to archetypal imagery. See, I would interpret that as two serpents and a column, which is really a form of the caduceus, or the kind of the Kundalini chakra image. It's an extraordinarily archetypal image. And part of my argument is that, well, consciously you may be interpreting these numbers as quantities. Your unconscious is interpreting them as little pictograms. So I think that this accounts for a lot of numerological stuff. Certain numbers carry numinosity by way of their dual function as images, fundamentally. But anyway, I want to get up. I don't think I need 10,000 pixels to do what I'm about to do. But 1,000 by 1,000 would be nice. Or rather, 10,000 squared, whatever. You know what I mean. Okay. Here's this big event that happens. 9/11. I'm going to mark it with 191 because it's the superior numeroglyph, basically. And let's get it. See, this is why I'm just being stupid. I should do this on another layer, but whatever. So here's this big event. Now, keep in mind this idea of Godzilla, right? Godzilla as being a film about the atomic bomb without explicitly being about the atomic bomb. It should be possible to look through media and try to track sort of its referentiality in relation to 9/11, right? So it's one way to do that would be to do so explicitly. So you just look through films and you say, well, this is a film called 9/11, this is a movie called World Trade Center. These are movies that are explicitly about 9/11. So obviously they're about 9/11, but that's very shallow because we all know that with art, you have things like Captain America Civil War that aren't... No one ever says explicitly it's about 9/11, but it's obviously about 9/11. And then if you look into some of the details, there are all these little clues that it's about 9/11. And so that's a subtextual... It's subtextually about 9/11. And so you can track it in both ways. You can track both the explicit and the implicit referentiality. And what you would expect, right, is you would expect it to basically start, make this a little bigger, you'd have a whole bunch of stuff that's reacting to 9/11 early on, and then it decays. Okay, so that's time. Actually, this is time. So as time goes forward, right, you would expect your references to decrease. Although interestingly, there should be a little bit of a weird kind of counter slope in there, maybe something kind of like that, which is tracking the explicit-implicit relationship, right? Because when the event first happens, it's too traumatic to look at directly. So actually it should look like this. That's F for frequency. So the total number of references to 9/11 should just decrease overall with time and should be very high right after the event because everyone's reacting to it consciously or unconsciously. But initially the explicitness, so that's going to be E, the explicitness should be very low. Perhaps it's sort of more like this. There's a little bit of a counter motion there, maybe. So as time goes on, there are fewer total references, but the references can be more explicit. And we can start to get movies that are just dramatic retellings of 9/11 explicitly. You can't do that right after the event. It's too raw, right? So I've probably overstated that thing. It's probably a shorter arc of like this or something. And then it stays steady, maybe something like that. This is just what one would normally expect. And I think that you would probably find, although, to be honest, I've not paid that much attention to this side of the temporal equation. Because what we also find, or what I'm arguing that you find, is something like this going in the opposite direction. So in other words, the references to the event seem to begin earlier in time. So it's all well and good to find these sorts of allusions to 9/11 in films released after 2001. That's just to be expected. So, Captain America Civil War is in there somewhere. It's somewhere in there probably, because it's not fully explicit yet, and we're not that far away from the event yet. So I don't know. I'm just arbitrarily, this is obviously a pretend graph. But the alarming thing is that we seem to see just the same kind of symbolic reference that we uncovered in Captain America. You can discover things of that nature, and sometimes it's very impressive. Like, I can't wait to jump into the actual artifacts here. But you can discover these things that really seem like they're micro-symbolically, or somehow as a whole, the film, in a more emergent way, really seems like it's about 9/11 in a symbolic sense. Or not precisely in a symbolic sense, but that it uses symbolism to convey what appears to be reference to a historical event. And it kind of starts around, I believe it's 1978, as far as I know. When did the Medusa Touch come out? The Medusa Touch, so yeah, it's 78. The Medusa Touch is the earliest instantiation of a red twin stack that I know of. But anyway, so yeah, let's say it starts, somewhere, because I don't really know, approximately in 78, and then this stretches out into the future, like 2020. And so references to the event appear to begin in about 78, and then they sort of start intensifying as they approach the event. So it's like the explicitness over here is also increasing. Then it drops right when the event happens, right? So that's our E over here. So the explicitness is building along with the. I'm not sure if it's building along with the frequency, the number of references. Again, this is part of the problem here, is that my data set is still a little too thin to really know something like this with good precision. This is what I'm showing you is my sense of what this thing looks like, for whatever that's worth. After I don't know how many, probably easily thousands of hours I've spent immersed in this research. This is what the situation looks like to me. Whether or not it actually looks like this, I think we actually have to get some more sophisticated machine learning-based approaches on this problem. That's incidentally why I brought up Hinton before, and this notion of high-dimensional coincidence filtering, because it makes sense that you would encounter this idea also in that domain, because it's fundamentally we're dealing with a signal-to-noise problem, right? And so if you're trying to separate signal from noise, a really great way to do that is by scanning for high dimensionality. And that's what that's what we're plotting here. Every thing on, every point on this line that we're counting as a reference is actually a deep vector with a high dimensional structure. So it represents the event not just in one way, in multiple ways that are quite consistent, both in terms of their content and in terms of the manner of their representation. Right? This notion of representing the towers with a candle, or representing them with tall things that are red and appear in pairs, or things of that nature. That's just one aspect, of course. There's a whole bunch of secondary characteristics that come along with it. Also, I'm noticing that this looks a whole lot like a mountain or a volcano, which is also a symbol of the self, and the erupting volcano is, I think, a constellating image in the collective unconscious at the moment. So, which is a little bit alarming. It's not necessarily, it doesn't, with this, you don't know at what register to perceive these patterns necessarily. A volcano erupting has symbolic meaning. It has to do with an eruption of unconscious contents, which is what happens during the individuation process, and is, I feel like I need to go to a finer grain over here while I doodle, and is, well, now I just want to doodle. Sorry, guys. I'm gonna have to just sit here and watch me just draw weird stuff. Well, maybe just shifting gears here. A problem that I have with this is maybe I can get up. Maybe I can get up the. Well, okay, that's a lovely piece of something. Yeah, let's minimize it. Okay, I might just edit that out so you don't see somebody else's text. But so this is a Jung quote that I often come back to. It says, "It does not, of course, suffice simply to connect a dream about a snake with the mythological occurrence of snakes. For who is to guarantee that the functional meaning of the snake in the dream is the same as in the mythological setting? In order to draw a valid parallel, it is necessary to know the functional meaning of the individual symbol, and then to find out whether the apparently parallel mythological symbol has a similar context and therefore the same functional meaning. Establishing such facts not only requires lengthy and wearisome researches, but is also an ungrateful subject for demonstration. As the symbols must not be torn out of their context, one has to launch forth into exhaustive descriptions, personal as well as symbological, and this is practically impossible in the framework of a lecture. I have repeatedly tried it at the risk of sending one half of my audience to sleep." So this is what Jung is saying about the nature of symbolic analysis. And it's actually really funny to me that I think, like a lot of people, I got into this stuff through sync blogs, Subliminal Synchrosphere and various others, which I could mention, but I'm sure everyone is familiar with. And one of the interesting things about those blogs is that they have this quality, right? It's a real liability with sync research. It's just like, you're kind of just listing things. You're like, and then there's this property, and then there's this property, and there's this property. And the idea is that you're laying down the high-dimensional structure of the coincidence. And so you're sort of you're hoping that the audience is letting all those details aggregate, so at the end they have a good model. But it's quite repetitive. It lends itself to very repetitive. And I'm not criticizing, by the way, any of these blogs. I'm about to launch into a very slow, tedious discussion of a lot of movies, and it's going to be just like those blogs. But the interesting thing to me is it's also just like Jung's research. Like, if you read Psychology and Alchemy, it's Jung's analysis of Wolfgang Pauli's dreams, and they read just like these blogs, because he's so zeroed in on these tiny details, and it's so slow and methodical, and you can't see the whole structure yet. You've got to let it come up out of the detail. And so this is just an aspect of this sort of work. And so I hope that, if you're going to stick around for this new wave of videos, you've got to have a little bit of an interest in some extreme micro detail, because we're going to be definitely going through it. So this has been almost another hour, and we just looked at that one, just basically this little intro from Captain America. I'm wondering if I shouldn't, just in the interest of not exhausting myself in one day, because I think the quality starts to suffer as it's actually, there's a fair amount of energy involved in staying eloquent and keeping the threads organized and going and all of that. So I think maybe, unfortunately, that's 2 hours of content. Tomorrow maybe I'll try to do another 2. And tomorrow we're going to jump into, I think we're going to jump into Gremlins, because I think it's the best, or Gremlins 2 in particular. I think it's the best entryway into the Constellation. And I don't know if we probably aren't going to get through the whole Gremlins experience in 2 hours. We'll see how long it goes. But yeah. All right. Well, thanks for sticking around, and hope to see you in the future.